you everyone for being here. Just so you all know, the recording will only function so that it captures the people who are actively speaking and the presentation. So you don't have to worry about being recorded or anything like that. I wanted to welcome you to our Breaking Through Burnout workshop. This is put on by Project Ocean, which is a peer organization underneath CAPS. And the presenters are myself, Dana Ocampo. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I currently am a third-year master's student in the Student Development and Higher Education program. And I am a grad peer educator with CAPS. Yeah, and I'll hand it off to my co-presenter.
All right, thank you so much, Dana. I'm Brianna Proud, and my pronouns are she, they, he, may. And I am currently a third-year design major, and I'm really excited to get started with this workshop. Just to let y'all know, this is our kind of first organized workshop for the semester. So hope y'all enjoy this, and let's get talking about burnout.
Yay! Okay, let me go ahead and put in. So we're just going to be doing a brief overview. This is the opening. Hello, everyone. You might have got a message as you were coming in that the workshop's being recorded. Don't worry about it. It's recording the speakers and the presentation. We're going to go over defining burnout. What is it? And then we'll also be talking about the sources of burnout. Where does it actually come from? What are the things that exacerbate it in our lives? We'll be talking about burnout remedies. How do we actually get through this and fix our burnout? And then we'll be wrapping it on up. So that's just a roadmap of exactly where we're headed today.
All right, thank you so much, Dana, for kind of giving us that outline. So first of all, we're going to start defining burnout. And I just want to kind of start this out with saying that everyone might have a slightly different version of what burnout means to you. And honestly, burnout is a pretty big term. So one definition of burnout might be good for someone, it might not be good for someone else. And so today we're just going to kind of be going through our experiences with burnout and just kind of seeing what it means. All right, so just to get us all started out, we are going to ask you, how do you define burnout? So feel free to just put it in the chat if you want to, or you can also unmute yourself too. We just want to hear your thoughts. And like it says here at the bottom, burnout manifests differently for everyone. So just a really important reminder. All right, I'm already seeing some stuff here in the chat. So we got Michael saying about having nothing left in the tank and lack of motivation. Wow, that's a really good phrase, having nothing left in the tank. I appreciate that. And Mylea says that my body starts to feel heavy, even if I'm just getting up to do something small. Yes, for sure. The kind of physical effects that you have are also related to burnout. Sometimes you might think that burnout is just kind of one thing, but as we'll be getting into, it really just kind of goes into so many different aspects of your total being. And Karen says feeling overwhelmed. Venus says the loss of motivation and creativity. And that one too, I feel that last one with creativity too, because I'm an art major, and for me, burnout definitely dips into the kind of loss of creativity and not really knowing what to do. And that can really affect me too. Wow, we are getting so many answers. Y'all are popping off in the chat. Thank you. Okay. We have Daniel saying, I am unable to start motivation and I really only feel like doing tasks when they're last minute. Yes, procrastination really is a very key part of, or not really a key part, but it's just pretty integral to burnout, in my opinion. Just kind of feeling some sort of anxiety about it in a way where it's just too overwhelming and you feel I just have to get back to it another time, but then it all just kind of comes intensely at one moment. So thank you, Daniel, for mentioning that. And then we have Israel saying that burnout for them is just feeling lost and overwhelmed and starting to just lose interest in everything and don't feel like doing anything. Yes, absolutely. Those are all really good things that you mentioned. And then one last one, mentioning that just knowing what I need to do, but instead laying down for the entire day. That is a mood that happens. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your definitions of burnout. We got so many really good answers, and there's a lot of things we'll be talking about here. So I'm glad that y'all were able to open up about that. So we were just going to start out this workshop with kind of looking at this graph. And I wanted to ask everyone, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. You can put in the chat, But does anyone have any guesses about what performance might have to do with your stress level?
Sure, there's a certain amount of stress that is good for you, and so it helps you, perform. But then you get to a point where your stress level becomes unhealthy, and then your performance begins to decline.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing that with us and for joining us here today. And yeah, we were definitely going to talk about that, how stress at a certain amount can be a motivator to do things, but if it becomes too much and it becomes like an overload or even burnout, then it could be really detrimental to you. And Michael also said if they're too stressed, then they can feel overwhelmed and can't focus on one task at a time. That's also another kind of result of burnout, is that your ability to focus declines. Your performance is once again kind of tied in with that too. So yeah, thank you for sharing, Michael. So yeah, these are some really great answers that we had about how performance is related to stress. And if anyone has anything else to contribute to this, go ahead and put it in the chat. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of get more into this as well. Yes, and Mylea was saying that it feels kind of like a whirlwind, even if it's something small, for sure. So as we're going to be getting into the basic kind of definition of burnout, is that it is a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. And it was originally coined by the American psychologist Herbert Freudenberger in the 1970s. And while at first it was originally just meant to kind of describe people that were in certain helping professions like nurses, as you could tell now, especially like in this culture and in this society, there really is so much more relevance to just anyone. And we want to emphasize today that anyone can experience burnout. And normally, as it's listed here, it can be characterized by things like exhaustion, listlessness, and increased feelings of cynicism and aggravation. So as you can see here, the effects of burnout, like I was mentioning, is just kind of a combination of emotional kind of stress and physical stress as well. And it all can really kind of combine together in a way where it can act like quicksand. So if you don't really tend to maybe what burnout can, or what burnout does for you, then it can really pull you in. So today we are going to talk about some of the things that we can look out for to try to be maybe more proactive and seeing what burnout can look like for us and trying to relieve it before it gets any worse. So here we're going to start talking about some of the sources of burnout. And we have quite a few listed here. And I really wanted to emphasize on this slide that we are mostly college students here. And so a lot of the times we have really like unique and also multiple stressors that can apply to our situation. So besides like having school responsibilities and other academic things that we're trying to juggle, we might have other things in our life, finances, trying to find a balance with like outside work that you might have, and trying to also work through maybe other events that might pop up. So many things can really come together into your life to possibly create maybe a very like kind of stressful situation possibly. And so we wanted to look through some of those things in each area. And then if you relate to any of these, then I know for me at least that when I was looking at this list, I was able to kind of take note like, oh, hey, for this one, I feel like I relate to it a lot and it's really been affecting me recently. Maybe I should kind of check in on that. So if you want to do that for yourself and kind of look into that, then I really encourage you to do that. So some of the ones that we have listed here is for work and school. So in work and school, you might possibly encounter feeling like maybe there's little to no control that you have in school, such as maybe feeling like you don't have as much impact on how you're doing academically, and that can affect you. Additionally, there could be like a lack of recognition of rewards. So at work, maybe you feel like your fellow coworkers or your employer aren't really acknowledging what you're doing and the progress that you're making. And that can definitely be a source of burnout. It can definitely make you feel like, hey, I'm doing all these things, but like, what is it for? So there's that. And then it could also even translate to school as well, where let's say you feel like you're not really being acknowledged for the things that you're doing by your teacher and not maybe getting the feedback that you'd appreciate. Additionally, there could be a feeling of monotony, or maybe that something is unchallenging and that you're maybe not getting the things that could help you grow and kind of progress as an individual. Additionally, work or school could have some sort of disorganization or a high pressure environment that could make you feel kind of overwhelmed or maybe misguided about what direction it might take, and just kind of feeling that overwhelm. Additionally, burnout can also seep into lifestyle. So for example, working too much can definitely lead to a burnout if there's maybe no kind of breaks that you would have in between. Additionally, if there's too many expectations or responsibilities that you feel that you hold without having maybe a support or a community to kind of help you out in the process, it can become very overwhelming. And additionally, a lack of sleep can be really kind of a source for burnout. I know for me, in the past couple weeks, I was really trying to put forward my best foot in my academics, trying to finish all my work and saying, okay, I will go to sleep right after this. I will finish this assignment so I don't have to worry about it tomorrow. But oftentimes I would encounter that would just make me feel super exhausted the next day. And while I did finish that work, I would have to spend the next day kind of recovering, and I wasn't really able to get to other things. So for me, that is kind of how my burnout ended up manifesting. And so for this, at least, you can kind of recognize, seeing if this is the current way that I do things, and this is how it kind of comes out, then, why is this happening? And just kind of recognizing maybe where you can step back. And another thing too to look at is just kind of internal burnout causes. So if you have chronic worry, pessimism, or negative self-talk, or maybe even experience a sense of kind of perfectionism or all or nothing thinking, that can contribute to it too. And Dana, I know you have a great kind of perspective on perfectionism. So if you want to go ahead and share that, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. I always say that I'm a recovering perfectionist, because there are some things where you need to realize that it just doesn't exactly aid you the same way that it could, right? In the sense of, if you want to perfection, I like try to attain this ideal perfection where nothing goes wrong and there's nothing that can be improved. It's one, recognizing that that doesn't exist, right? But also recognizing that even if something does go wrong in like a small little way, the rest of it can still be good in the product that you make. And is recognizing that even what you like, whatever you make, the act of making it is also something that's really impressive. And that idea of perfectionism and putting something off, that's also part of procrastination. Just because like procrastination is like, it's mostly motivated by anxiety, not laziness. We really need to talk about that. And being able to recognize that there are just different aspects to all of these things that can also lead to burnout. And the idea that if you continue to contribute and try to make things as perfect as they can be, you might not be expending the same kindness to yourself because you're trying to make something that doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Totally right. Thank you so much for that, Dana. And I guess knowing all of this, we're going to start moving on into the cultural aspects of burnout.
Yeah, so similarly, we can talk about all of this, right? For one, the expectations of high performance can come externally or internally. So one of the things that I want to recognize is that since we are, for the most part, students here, right? And being, some of us are also working, some of us are also taking care of our families. There are expectations of high performance in the sense that just because like the grading system, the way that it exists as it is, always trying to reach that A, that is an external pressure that we don't always seem to be aware of, but that's something that is basically always placing a judgment on like what you're doing, and that's especially true in like college and going to somewhere like Cal State Long Beach, also thinking about it like internally in the ways that we all expect these things of ourselves too. and being like, oh, I have to be a high performer so that I can gain respect from my peers. Oh, I have to be a high performer so that I can create this awesome thing. And you can love this thing, you could have passion for it, but at the same time, recognizing that if you are trying to be high performing at all times with no breaks, it's sort of like the idea where I think that like people aren't like mad at someone who like completed a sprint, right? No one's like, oh, why are you tired? All you did was sprint. But for some reason, when we talk about like our emotional and mental way that we run ourselves into the ground, like we're constantly sprinting, we're always so mean to ourselves, and recognizing that that is also like part of the cultural aspects, right? There are other things in terms of like first generation students, for example, knowing that if you're the first in your family to do anything, that is another expectation placed on you. I was the first to get my master's degree, for example, and that is also high performance, not only of myself, but also family and my community members, right? Recognizing also how helping professions have higher levels of burnout and also have higher levels of turnover in their workforces. And we see that right now. I mean, in terms of like all of the news lines that are talking about like people who are that they're hiring everywhere it's hiring, right? But also recognizing that burnout is more likely to hit helping professions because of something called compassion fatigue. And this can also happen in like your day-to-day life, because basically what compassion fatigue is that if you are constantly looking after other people, or you are taking on their trauma or something that they shared with you that's really heavy and emotional, while it's amazing to be a supportive friend, it's also important to recognize that secondary trauma is a real thing that exists. And taking on another person's problems, right, and the things that come up and all of their heavy stuff, that is also heavy on you now. There's a reason why like therapists always have their own therapists in terms of like working through all of our stuff, you know? So yeah, recognizing that nurses, teachers are more likely to have burnout, but also if you are like a really great friend and you are always listening to the things that come up for your other friends, you might also be experiencing higher levels of burnout. And the final one that we are all going through is the idea that we are going through a pandemic. And even though we are being told we are post-pandemic because everything is starting to open up again, recognizing that if for whatever reason you're like, this semester is really hard, or like this year is really hard, talk about like a high expectation. It's the idea that you're supposed to go to work and learn and do all of things while also trying to like maintain health boundaries and like staying alive and staying healthy for you and your family. So I want to like acknowledge all of these things because like Bria said, there are different things that cause burnout in terms of like personal or like other like things that might apply only to you, but also there are other aspects where it just becomes this like this is just part of like the world that we live in, and recognizing that all of these things matter. And you should also be nice to yourself, because I also think that when it comes to figuring about burnout and all of these feelings we have about it, we are very quick to be like, oh, I'm feeling so lazy, or like, oh, I feel so weak, or like, I can't believe I can't get through this, right? Or being really mad at yourself for not being able to do basic tasks. But it is more likely than not you. And it's important to recognize that when you're feeling this tired, it's because you've been working really hard, and it's because you've gone through a lot. And it's important to let yourself have like a space to heal. So some of the final aspects that we're going to talk about in terms of culture, it is important to recognize that in a specifically American context, right, when we talk a lot about capitalism or like the Protestant work ethic, you don't need to be Protestant to have this apply to you. For the record, it's something that was like embedded in our country in the 1700s. And being able to recognize this historical structure, the everything that has to do with it, that is something that you are constantly told, right? So when you're constantly told that like your worth is like related to what career you have, that is something that you're told, and you might not even realize it, because even be in like small insidious ways, like everyone asking like, oh, what are you going to do after you graduate? Like, oh, what are your career goals? Instead of asking things like, how are you doing? When is your next vacation? Which is a really important question we should all be asking ourselves, you know? And how are you taking care of yourselves? Similarly, it sort of ties into the idea of like the hustle, right? Hustle culture, gig economy, side gigs. I bring this up because I also think it is sort of like talking about how like money has to be involved in all of these things. So for example, if there's something you're really passionate about, there's always this conversation about how do you monetize it, which I think can often be really difficult. So for example, like I have a friend who like really likes making stickers, and then they were asked like, oh, you want to sell these on Etsy? And I think that it's really great in order to think about this, and also think about like, it's awesome. And I also want to recognize that there's a certain privilege in terms of like talking about money, and that it is important to be able to have a certain like socioeconomic safety. But with all of these things in mind, recognizing that it's also okay to take a breath, to breathe. And these reminders are similar to that, right? Talking about how like the results of your work and the results of anything you do not equal your self-worth, right? I can be super proud of you for completing a project, but at the same time, like recognizing that you're all here joining us on a Friday and this is free, and you're letting us spend this time with you. So I, for one, am so grateful, but also recognizing that like it's awesome that you did that, you know, being able to take a second to learn about how to better take care of yourself, that's fantastic. And your self-worth is just not tied to anything that you produce. You are worthy as a person if you never work another day in your life, because you're a human being and you deserve it. Similarly, I want to talk about how like life is a marathon, not a sprint. We're not in a hurry to go anywhere. I also think like I also say that like life is the longest thing you're ever gonna do, so take it easy. You're gonna have time. You're gonna be able to do whatever you need, and be able to just take a breather sometimes, you know. Because I think a lot of the times when we do need to do things, like you want to get your degree, right? You want to get a good job. You want to do all of these things, but at the same time, like it shouldn't come at the cost of your humanity and your like mental health, you know, and being able to take care of yourself. And finally, the last one is similarly, not every hobby needs to be monetized or productive. A lot of the things that you can do are free. I know that we live in California for the most part, so it's hard to find things that are super cost effective, but at the same time, knowing that like, for example, like beaches are free, picnics are free. Yeah, being able to do like small things, right? And like being more like cost effective about it. I think I gave the example earlier that like if you buy a kite once, but like the wind is free, so you can go ahead and enjoy yourself that way. Being able to do self-care without having to spend tons of money on it, because that's also a part of capitalistic culture, but let's not get into that. But yeah, so that's just a big summary of the ways that the different cultures that we experience also affect and lend to burnout. So I'll hand it back over to Bree.
All right, thank you so much, Dana, for wrapping all of that up. And I even feel better after you said everything there. So thank you for that. We just wanted to come in here with a little interlude and just like a really mini activity. It's not going to take very long, but it's called a wellness wheel. And I guess I can ask this in the chat. Does anybody have any guesses as to maybe what a wellness wheel might be, just based off the picture? You got Daniel saying a food pyramid. Well, that is a really good description. Honestly, I think it does kind of feel like, you know, the plates that you used to see on the graphics for like when you were back in school, and they used to be like, oh, a balanced plate, you know? So honestly, that is like on a perfect metaphor to describe this. But this wellness wheel is basically like a balanced plate to see how you're doing in each of these aspects. Yeah, see, Israel's also agreeing. Very nice. So we got the physical aspects, how you're doing in finance, occupation, you know, work, intellectually, how you're feeling, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. Of course, these are 6 really like general categories. And this wellness wheel also has versions where it is broken down into smaller bits, but this is the one that can kind of just like show you maybe what a wellness wheel can generally look like. So what we hope everyone might be able to do and participate with us is just drawing out a wheel on a piece of paper, or maybe even a bar graph if you prefer that, if you are not so confident about your circles. Because honestly, for me, I'm not super confident about my circles, and I am an art major. So there's also another version you could do if you're trying to just do it on your laptop or whatever device you're doing it on, maybe typing in your notes app and changing the color of your text and just filling out each of these areas. And then also for each section, just like ranking how well you think you've been fulfilling these goals out of 100%. So I wanted to give an example of this, and I will be putting a link in the chat just to show everyone some of these questions that could be there. And we were hoping also at a later time to kind of get more into this on our Instagram too. So this will definitely be an activity we will be revisiting. So look forward to that. But basically each of these sections, I'll just give one sample question, and then hopefully that'll get everyone kind of a little bit more knowledgeable about what each section is supposed to be. So for the physical section, one thing that it could consider is just exercise and diet. So one example is I exercise at least 3 times per week. For the finance and occupation section, an example could just be about your beliefs and values around money, kind of knowing how you're doing in work and school and seeing if you have a balance with that, and seeing if, for example, I have financial plans for the future. So that's another thing that you can consider. For the intellectual section, one of the examples here on the PDF that I sent there says, I have specific intellectual goals, for example, learning a new skill or a specific major. So this is just kind of building yourself up intellectually, and that can be like critical thinking, creativity, curiosity, just exploring things that you're interested in. For the emotional section, there's an example saying, I express my feelings appropriately. So for emotional wellness, that could look like knowing how to regulate emotions, knowing your feelings to things, seeing if your reactions are maybe like kind of reasonable for you, and just general cognition. And then for the social one, it's an example showing here is that I'm able to resolve conflicts in all areas of my life. So for social, it could be things related to your meaning, to your values, and also maybe related to the relationships you have with others and just other kind of general social interactions. And then last but not least, the spiritual section has an example that says that I practice meditation, or I pray or engage in some type of growth practice. And for spiritual wellness, it could just kind of talk with the ethics, the principles, the morals that guide you. So I hope that that explanation kind of helped clarify for everyone. And I'm going to give it one more minute, but I just wanted to ask this kind of general question to everyone once they finish up their little wheel. And the question here is, how does everyone feel? And how do you think you're personally doing after filling out your wellness wheel? So feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to put it into the chat. I know that I myself also have to do this eventually. I think this is a great way to really just kind of check in on yourself and just kind of find maybe what things that I might want to work on and try to improve for myself so that I could just have better wellness throughout my day-to-day.
I remember one of our professors did this in one of our master's classes for counseling, and oh my gosh, it was so funny to realize that, like, oh, I do have room for improvement in a lot of places. But it was also nice to be able to like take inventory and see exactly which places, and it was also nice to recognize which areas I was doing well and flourishing, you know, because I think that these are definitely, there's ebbs and flows like there is with the rest of life. So yeah, thought I'd share my own experience.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. And I guess I will go ahead and just share really quickly before we move on to our next slide. But for me, yeah, I think that this was also a great way for me to kind of like check in with myself. And sometimes I never even considered that some of things were something that could be kind of impacting to my wellness. But you know, here we are. We got Jennifer saying the physical pie pieces at 0%. Oh my goodness, I know what that's like. It is a struggle. But without further ado, we will go ahead and, oh, we got one more comment. My pie isn't 100%. And you know what? That is totally okay. Yeah, I think that it's great to also recognize that you don't always have to be at your 100%. And at least, you know, you taking the time to come here to the workshop, like Dana was saying earlier, is already a great first step to kind of like knowing what you can look out for now, you know? There you go. All right. And then Dana's is coming to walk on the beach. That's perfect.
Yeah, the beach is free. All right, let's get into the bread and butter, the things that we would love to actually walk away with, right? In terms of being able to take very concrete steps and try to how to improve our relationships with burnout, because I feel like we're all feeling it, but also thank you all so much for all of your participation in the chat. It's really nice to hear all your voices. But yeah, so this is a joke that I understand very well, where it's the idea of, and what do we do when we are sad? Add to cart. No, that's not what we're working on today. We're trying to figure out exactly ways to improve our lives without spending a single dime. Even though it can definitely feel like sometimes self-care is buying yourself something a little nice, you know? But to talk about our coping strategies, this is basically the map of where we're headed after this, right? We're going to be looking for finding opportunities for control, considering that one of our sources of burnout that we touched on earlier was little to no control in our lives. Figuring out how to establish boundaries, which are incredibly important, and also how to maintain those boundaries, because having that conversation is really important. And then being able to also allow for rest. And this is really hard because we've talked about all the different ways that our society pushes us to do more and more and more. But finding these moments for rest can be really helpful and rejuvenating, even if you take just a couple minutes out of your day. So yeah, we'll move right on to the next part, which is finding the little pockets of control in your day, right? So one of the things that you can do when you look over yourself and your schedule is noting your moods, figuring out exactly what is meaningful to you, and figuring out what drains your energy and also what gives you energy, right? So for example, if like you find yourself stuck in these meetings that are absolutely dreadful, it can be really important to recognize that maybe I should take less of those meetings, or maybe we'll do those meetings while also doing something else, right? Finding a way to liven them up a little so that they're not quite so soul sucking. Or if you find something that you really enjoy, so for example, if you really like working with one person in particular because you, I don't know, you have a laugh while you're working, or you're able to feel really settled and comforted when you're working with another person, being able to do more projects with them in particular, something like that, you know, to be able to note exactly how you're feeling and find how to make the slight tweaks to your schedule to be able to get a little bit more control in your day, right? Another thing to think about is tracking your flow patterns in terms of exactly how do you get the workload done. Do you do easy tasks first and then difficult? So some advice that I got that's really useful is if it takes less than 5 minutes to do it, just do it. So that way you can actually cross something off your to-do list right away. In general, the advice is that your to-do list shouldn't be more than about 7 to 8 things in a day. And I know that I'm also guilty of sometimes putting tons of things on my to-do list and feeling super overwhelmed. So being able to prioritize and be like, these are the things that I absolutely need to do. So that way you don't feel quite so, I don't know, burdened by like the everything of life, you know, and being able to take care of yourself that way. Similarly, we can also talk about, do you do a big challenge and then coast for the rest of the day? So for example, knowing exactly when you're able to focus more. So say, for example, if you're a morning person, maybe you should actually put your big challenge first. So that way you can devote a lot of your mental energy to that. And that way, once that big challenge is done, for the rest of your day, you just get to vibe and do the smaller tasks. And that way, that can be also simpler for you to figure out what best works for you, because we're all different and we have different cycles and schedules. Similarly, finding what you can change. I know that we're guilty of either sleeping too much or sleeping too little. I'm gonna admit right now that I accidentally fell asleep at 8 p.m. last night, and I was like, oh, I'm at the exhaustion point of the curve. You know, I'm right before burnout. And being able to recognize that I needed that time. So I'm not super mad at myself for sleeping. I was like, that was pretty good actually. But also knowing that there are other things to know. So for example, knowing that sleep is basically the process of your mind consolidating memories throughout the day. So if you're studying, you could always study in the hours before you go to sleep instead of sleeping first and then waking up early to finish an assignment. Because the way that it works is that if you study before you go to sleep, your mind is more likely to consolidate and remember exactly everything that you learned. Similarly, when you talk about like study area, for example, there is a phenomenon where if you are in a certain environment, you are more likely to recall information from that environment. So if you are in a quiet place like the library when you are taking a test, and then you later have another test, doing it in a quiet place means that you are more likely to have recall of exactly what you studied in that area. And knowing that that's just a smart way to do a slight change in whatever you're doing and figuring out how to make it work for you, you know? Similarly, work hours. I know that we all need to work and we all need money to live, and that's important. but also knowing that maybe if possible, for example, midterms and finals, knowing those places on your deadline and your syllabus and being able to plan ahead for them so you can adjust your hours. So for example, if you work part-time, you'll just shift your hours to a different week where it's a little bit less hectic. So that way you can devote all of yourself to your studies or all of yourself to work. Because for example, multitasking, studies on multitasking have proven that everyone who thinks they're good at multitasking isn't actually that good at it. And it's such a hard pill to swallow, but knowing that it's important to recognize that being able to put all of your focus on one thing is better for you than like trying to study for a test while you're also at work. It just means that your performance in both is going to suffer. So knowing all of these little things that you can do in terms of strategizing, I have a friend who actually has ADHD, but she's also a teacher, and therefore she has to do a lot of things with her day. She tells me that she starts the day by creating this to-do list for herself to sort of form a strategy of like big things that have to be done by the end of the day or things that would be nice to do. So the things that you have to do and things that like, if you have the energy for, go ahead and do that, you know, and figuring out how to take care of yourself that way. Next, we're going to talk about identifying boundaries. There are about 5 of them that we're going to highlight here. So physical boundaries, personal space, and physical touch, things that you should just define for yourself to know. Because if you make these decisions and definitions now, they'll be easier to maintain later. So for example, if you're encountering a stranger during these times, 6 feet away, it's a reasonable physical boundary to keep with them, right? And then also thinking about things like intellectual boundaries and ideas. So being able to be like, yes, I am ready to share ideas with you right now, or I need a little bit longer for this idea to cook before I can give you something good. Is that reasonable with you? And being able to tell someone no, right? Emotional boundaries, feelings, and sharing information. So there is actually a different study. I'm going to keep throwing studies out there. I'll give you all the sites if you want them. But there is a different study that said that basically, if you are a person who loves to share your feelings with other people, and it's really important for you to be able to communicate that way, studies have shown that if you are then encouraged to share, you're going to feel a whole lot better, right? But if you are a person who doesn't tend to share a lot, or you don't feel comfortable, or you need a little bit more time to yourself before you communicate your thoughts and feelings on something, if you are then encouraged to share, you will actually feel worse. And it's important to recognize that and know yourself before you think about how much you take on. And similarly, I also think that since we talked about like compassion fatigue earlier and the way that helping professions are more prone to burnout, being able to tell a friend like, oh, I'm at work right now. Can we talk about this later? Like, I care about you, but I can't do like 7 things at once. And I want to, yeah, yes. Okay. And then I see that Israel put a post on Instagram where like, instead of saying I have to do, change it to I get to do. And I think that's really nice. It's really good way to do like very simple verbal reframing. I know that for me, my therapist did something life-changing where I was like, I have to do X, Y, and Z, but X, Y, Z, right? And then I was very prone to doing like putting like but as like my default conjunction in everything that I used to say. Instead, she suggested to me that I put and. So in that way, it becomes less of a mental barrier between the things that we say and do. Right, going back into this slide, material boundaries. Money and possessions, I feel like this one is fairly simple. If someone owes you money, figure out how you get that money back, something like that. And then time boundaries. In general, being able to do a time audit can be extremely helpful, and seeing exactly how much time you put into things in every day, right? So for me, when I realized how much I commute, it was awful. LA traffic is the worst. And I hated seeing exactly how much of my time would disappear. And then instead, what I started to do is that I would start listening to audiobooks, or I would start listening to podcasts. So that way I would feel like I would be learning something at the same time that I'm driving. So that was very, very helpful in terms of figuring out how to do these things. And then now, after you've identified these boundaries and defined these boundaries for yourself, it's also important to recognize that you need to learn how to maintain them. Because I also know that there are examples where, like, where if a friend asks you and you normally set aside like your Wednesdays to do some studying, and they're like, hey, new movie's out, want to go? You want to say yes. And being able to see if there's any chance that maybe you can go to a different showing so that you can still respect your like time boundaries. and be able to do what you want to do instead of just giving into the fun thing, you know, because it's important to recognize that there are still things that are integral to your own development that you need to protect. So protect your time, protect yourself, and protect your own boundaries, because like that's a form of self-care that is like worthy of like your own devotion, you know. So yeah, I think that'll bring me up to my last slide. So self-care and community care techniques. I think that in general, self-care is something that's been made into a bit of a meme, to be honest. But I also think it's important to highlight the importance of community care, right? Knowing that you're not alone going through all of this in this difficult time. As evidenced by this workshop, we are all experiencing burnout. And I have to tell you that every time I mention this workshop to someone, they're like, yes, I am feeling that, you know? So knowing that we're all going through it. So this is just a brief list of things you could do to suggest how you manage all of that, right? Yes, Scrubs is so good. But things like allowing extra time for projects. So giving yourself that leeway, knowing that you might not be performing at your best right now. And knowing that it's okay if you take a little bit of extra time, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. I really can't stress that enough. Stuff like that, you know? Similarly, another thing where leave work at the office may or may not be super productive in terms of like advice for right now, because you can't really, some of us are still at home. So instead, I would recommend establishing a clear boundary for work, life, and school. So one of those things is, for me, I used to work full time and I used to go to school full time. So that meant I would work from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and then class would start at 5:30 and I had 30 minutes. So that would be like the real struggle, right? So what I would do is I would take at least a little bit of that time. I would actually meditate briefly between my classes just to clear my head, you know, just to be like, okay, I'm leaving all the work behind now so that I can focus on studying and learning. Also, you could do other things like taking a brief walk around the block if you can, just so that you have like a physical refresh, so that you also have a little bit more room that way. I know there are people who, for example, if they're working on like work stuff, they will change their whole like screensaver into like a different image, or they would change the color theme of their windows to make sure that they know that this is work. And then doing similar things and like color coding their life basically to sort of like set those mental boundaries between the different things that they're doing, and being able to figure out how to do that so that you don't have everything sort of like running into each other, you know? So similar other things you can do is do not ruminate on the past. I also think one of the best advice I've gotten is you made the best decision that you could with the information you had at that time, and trusting yourself enough to know that you did your best and you can keep moving and keep doing your best moving forward. Other things, take a brisk walk, finish what you started so that way it's not like stuck in the back of your head. And then you could also like avoid caffeine, because caffeine is more likely to increase feelings of anxiety. And then other things like go seeing a friend or sharing your burdens with someone if that works for you, right? There was a different study that basically said that if you share an experience with someone, that experience is more likely to be enhanced. So for example, they had two people and they would eat chocolate together. And the people who ate chocolate in the presence of another person said that the chocolate tasted sweeter. So knowing that whatever you're doing, it can actually improve whatever it is that you got your mind on, you know? Yeah. And then finally, do something you love. Know that there is room to do that. Take care of yourself and definitely have a lot of room to breathe. Give yourself room to breathe and be able to know that your rest is just as important as anything else that comes up in life. Yeah. So I'm gonna ask the chat, what coping strategies do you use? I keep mentioning the beach because I always go to the beach. But if there's anything else, just feel free to put it in.
Something that I noticed, and maybe I missed it on the wellness wheel. I don't know if there was something on there for like hobbies or something, right? Doing something that isn't school or work related, and I definitely need to practice it more than I preach it. But what I found in COVID times before I started the program here at Long Beach was crafting for me, right? It can be paint by numbers are a lot easier than you think they are, and one will last you forever because it's so tiny. But I find it very like therapeutic. I tried coloring books, but I wanted to use gel pens and it wouldn't dry quick enough for me to like, so I'd have to like wait. So I didn't, anyway, so find what works for you, but you can find some cheap things. Also bubble baths, you can get, going back, my boss taught me that, but you can get like Dr. Teal's like essential oil Epsom salts for like $5 at Walmart and it'll last you a few. So that's what I find. I mean, now I have to actually like get in the habit of like making time for that again. But I find it's just nice to like shut my brain off for like 20, 30 minutes or maybe an hour. And that like kind of helps keep my sanity.
I love that. Thank you, Michael. Those are so many great suggestions. I'm like, wow, now I want to paint by color. And I see that Miley also put that she used to write things down or go on walks. Any other suggestions?
I saw that Mylea said that she used to write things down or go on walks. Yes. I think going on walks has also been super good for me too, because for me, I do have a pet doggo. Shout out to him. Love him so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, every time that I was having maybe a kind of bad day, like maybe at first I would kind of feel like all those emotions running. And then after a while of just walking with him, I'm just kind of like, that's it. It kind of all kind of alleviates once I start walking. So yeah.
Love that. I also love listening to music in between homework, taking 10-minute naps if I feel tired, talking with siblings about our days. Those are all great. Those are all wonderful coping strategies, especially like involving other people. I also think that's really nice. But yeah, I think that's really great. Thank you all so much for sharing. Really appreciate it. I think I just put a tip that giving advice actually creates better habits than receiving advice. There was yet another study done that was shown that if you are more likely to give advice to other people, you not only feel a greater sense of self-worth, but you also are more likely to stick to the same habits that you gave advice for. Something like that can just be really helpful to know. So yeah, I think that brings us to the very end. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope it was helpful to you. I'm going to drop something in the chat where you can follow us on Instagram. That's where we'll be putting more of our workshops, more information, also more information on burnout that will hopefully be useful to you. And also if you could fill out our assessment, that would be super awesome just to know like what did you like about the program? What could we improve on? What would you like us to talk about next? We're actually letting people choose our next November Project Ocean event series theme for the month. So really, we're at your disposal. Say whatever you want. So I just wanted to thank you all so much again for sharing this time with us today. Really appreciate it.